Okay, in this presentation, we are going to look at part two of the four-part presentation of technocentric warfare in the ancient Greek world. In this section, we're going to talk about the advent of the machines themselves. What is the evidence for when, and I'm primarily concerned with chronology here, when they came online, and then secondly. The big question, was it a Greek innovation or what I think, a Phoenician innovation, borrowed, transferred and borrowed, maybe in a roundabout way? And to do this, we're going to look at three systems of fortification which we can date with some certainty. So three case studies, and the first one will be the bastion at Patara, which dates pretty solidly to between 370 and 334 BC. And then Medangekale, the Persian fortress there. And then Halicarnassus, only because we are told that Hecatomnus had these projectile firing machines at the time of Alexander's siege. So it was ready there. So we'll look at those three. These are contemporary with our developments. We'll see where it goes. The first thing we have to do, though, is kind of bring online these machines. And also, there's two steps. They were implemented in defensive systems, and that might not be all that difficult. But then they were taken into the field as offensive weapons, and that's one of the big questions. What we know is that Philip the Great and Alexander used these weapons for offensive purposes. They had a siege train, they took them and they besieged cities. And so the whole notion of sort of dismantleable machines and movable machines, portable machines, is another innovation. And all of this, once again, is happening in the 4th century BC. So we're looking here at ballistae. I'm thinking, and a ballista is basically what we could call it, maybe a crossbow on a stand. For the most part, they're relatively small. They can be handled by 2 to 3 men, and they would fire this meter-long iron arrow with enough force to go right through armor, and with enough accuracy to actually pick off people on the parapets, is what we're told. But they could be adapted to firing stones as well, as much as a 1-talent stone, 57-pound stones in this way. And in this way, they could attack walls. And so we have a little diagram at the base right here beside my head, which shows the kind of standard Roman siege weaponry. And we need to realize all these things are being used at once. You have ballistas, you have catapults, which have a different kind of torsion system. It can throw heavier rocks. The onager, another one of these kind of heavy rock firing machines, as well as battering rams and sheds for mining the walls, and then scaling ladders. So you would come at it with all these things at once. I mean, the battering ram against the gates, for example, and what have you. So these ballistae are maybe the earliest of these machines that came online, but let's look at what our evidence actually says. Oh, I forgot. A couple more pictures of ballistae. You can see they get taller. Look at the scale of the human over there to the right, although none of these have survived. So this is based on reliefs and whatever fragments have survived there. But you can see the sled, the trough in which the rocks would be fired this way. And what we're told is that once you get it set, once you get it in place and everything's, these bundles of sinew for firing these things were very fragile. You had to kind of loosen them up and get it set up. But then once it was set up, it had an accuracy of being capable of hitting within a square meter every shot. So you would aim at a weak spot and just start the process of bashing it down. Okay, so what we have here is a quote of Diodorus of Sicily, and he's talking about Dionysius, the tyrant of Syracuse, right around 385 BC. He had been conquering other cities on the island, and he recognized he was going to go to war with Carthage. It's interesting that in a chapter just before this chapter, it mentions the fact that he was able to attack Carthaginian machines that were besieging a town. He came and liberated this town. So it's interesting that these Carthaginians had machines at this point. So what it says here is, at once, therefore, he gathered skilled workmen, commandeering them from the cities under his control and attracting them by high wages from Italy and Greece, as well as Carthaginian territory. For his purpose was to make weapons in great numbers and every kind of missile, and also quadraremes and quinqueremes. These are decked warships. We'll talk about that some other time. This is the thing Diodorus mentions, no ships of the latter having ever been built. And he built them at this time. And after collecting many skilled workmen, he divided them into groups in accordance with their skills, and he appointed over them the most conspicuous citizens, offering great bounties to any who created a supply of arms. And then talks about the various kinds of arms. I want to stick with the machines. And since the Syracusans enthusiastically supported the policy of Dionysius, it came to pass that rivalry rose high in the manufacture of the arms. For not only were every space in Syracuse, such as porticos and back rooms of temples, as well as the gymnasia and the colonnades of the marketplace, crowded with workers, but the making of great quantities of arms went on, apart from such public places, in the most distinguished homes. In fact, the catapult was invented at this time in Syracuse, since the ablest skilled workmen had been gathered from everywhere into one place. The high wages, as well as the numerous prizes offered to the workmen, were judged to have been the best stimulated. And over and above these factors, I cut some stuff out. So Dionysius circulated daily among the workers, conversed with them in kindly fashion, and rewarded the most zealous with gifts, and invited them to his table. And consequently, the workmen brought unsurpassable devotion to the devising of the many missiles and engines of war that were all strange and capable of rendering great service. He also had catapults made at this time. Okay, so what is this telling us? He put together a big effort to construct these weapons, these machines, and that there were a variety of kinds. And if we had the suggestion, you might say, okay, this technology was in the winds, people were adapting it, and maybe certain types, such as these torsion firing machines, won out over others. And we see the rise of these ballista seem to be, I would think, the earliest of these. But he's saying the catapult was invented here as well. Okay, so that's 385. And it's interesting that when we look at evidence in Greece proper, we can see that these machines are in existence, particularly in Athens, being employed in their defenses as early as the 370s BC. It's not that far apart. So what do we have here? We have a fragmentary inscription that mentions catapults stored in the Acropolis in 371 BC. There is a gravestone found at the Piraeus, dated to the mid-4th century, mentioning a Heraclitus the Mysian who was a catapultist. There were 3 more Attic inscriptions that mention catapults and parts stored in the Acropolis. One mentions catapults stored in the Chalcotheke of the Acropolis, and another one mentions stocks that had come from Eretria, and then another one, it's Aristotle's Athenaeum Politeia, mentions that the Athenians implemented catapult training in the Ephebic system. All of this in the 4th century BC. And then Marsden points to the towers that are so uniform in the defenses at Messene, constructed by Epaminondas around 369 BC. These are pretty large towers, probably large enough, certainly large enough for ballistae. They have to be about 3 meters deep for a ballista. And catapults require something in the order of 5 to 10 meters, 5 to 15 meters. And so we get the really big towers when you get to the point where you've got these machines in them. They even have loopholes. We've seen them in the walls, and I'll try to show that later, so that these machines could pivot from window to window. You could actually wheel them around for firing range. This all fits. I haven't done enough work at Messina to suggest that there's any remodeling, although clearly there was, but I mean, it's all pretty uniform in construction. So what this is all telling us is by the 2nd quarter of the 4th century BC, these machines are being used in Greece as well. So it's in the wind, shall we say. Okay, and as Marsden points out, he tried to argue earlier, and I have his book right here just in case. Greek and Roman Artillery, The Historical Development, Oxford, 1969. There's 2 volumes to this. The other one is the actual, he edited the Greek treatises that talk about defenses, Greek defenses, and engineering. And so they kind of go side by side. But his point, and this is what I've been following up on, is that it looks like the design of fortresses, the design of fortification systems became adapted to the advent of these machines. Towers became mandatory now because you're going to have these machines out there defending the walls, for example. So systems like this, these long circuit walls that kind of go up off into the countryside, seemingly up on the hills. This is called a Gelandmauer system by the Germans. It means a system that extends its defenses beyond the built environment of the city into the surrounding countryside. Its main objective seems to be to deprive adversaries who are firing at the city from high points from which they could actually bombard the built environment of the city. Extend the walls out so far by taking those high grounds, then the enemy cannot use it against you. But that's indicating that we have offensive threats to that degree at this point. And so I don't know if we're quite ready to go that far. But let's just say, certainly from a defensive perspective, these weapons are in use at this time. Now, when did they become offensive weapons? Well, we have a couple of interesting mentions here, and the first one is this reference to, by Paulianus, the stratagems of Paulianus, smart ideas of ancient generals. And he's talking about Onomarchus, the Phocian, who was fighting during the Third Sacred War. He's fighting against Thebes, Thessaly, and Macedonia, all comers, right, using the treasury of Delphi to build a mercenary army. And so he's worried about the Macedonians. They're about to attack his army. And he comes up with this stratagem. So when Onomarchus was fighting against the Macedonians, he took up a position with a steep and craggy mountain to his rear. And on top of the mountain, he placed in ambush a number of men who were expert at throwing stones. Now, here's the weird thing about it. The translator has missed this one because the word is Petrobolus. That could mean the machine as well. So he put up men up there who were experts at firing these rock-throwing machines. With a supply of huge stones and pieces of jagged rock for this purpose. He then advanced and formed his army out on the plain. The Macedonians began their attack with their javelins, which the Phocians pretended they were unable to resist, and they retreated halfway up the mountain. So they drew the Macedonians toward the mountain. The Macedonians eagerly pursued them until they came within reach of the men in ambush, who then emerged and started to attack the Macedonian phalanx with huge stones. Onomarchus then gave the signal to the Phocians to turn around and renew their fight. The Macedonians, who were vigorously attacked by the troops in front of them and grievously harassed by those above them, with difficulty succeeded in making a rapid retreat. And on this occasion, Philip, the king of Macedonia, said to have cried out, "We do not run away, but retreat like rams, ready to renew the fight with greater strength." This is a bit garbled, but Marsden believed, and it makes sense, what they drew them into was a bunch of ballistae up on the hillside, firing rocks down at the Macedonians as they were coming up the hillside. And if so, then this is the first recorded case of these weapons being taken into the field. They could be dismantled, they could be carried, and they could be set up by teams of 2 to 3 men. That's the key there. Okay. And then what we know is that this was, the date of this battle was what? I believe it's 354. And then Philip, by the time of his siege of Perinthus, he had so many arrow-firing catapults of all sizes, he used these to destroy the enemy fighting on the battlements. And the Perinthians had to secure agreements to import missiles and catapults from Byzantium. This is in Diodorus once again. Besieged by Philip, Byzantium had very few machines, but sent them to Perinthus even though they had none to spare. So, interesting thing there. By this point, by 340 BC, Philip has got his own offensive weapons. he's besieging Perinthos. He's actually, again, using these ballistae more as anti-personnel weapons to pick off people on the parapets. And that Byzantium has these weapons, and they're sending them to Perinthos, even though they cannot afford to spare them because they have so few. So, point I want to stress with this is, these things were cutting-edge technology. They were extremely expensive and difficult to make. People had them. When you talk about the Diplon Gate at Athens, it may just be that they were there at gates, for example. They were there to protect the soft spots of the defenses in particular. But nonetheless, Philip has now taken them into the field. He has the means to take them into the field by 340 BC. Okay, and it even goes on that we know the name of his engineer. It was a Thessalian named Polydos, and that he was great at constructing these sorts of things. And that Polydos had two pupils, Diades and Carias, who ended up going on campaigns with Alexander himself. So there's even a lineage to these engineers. And what I'm getting at is, we know the names of these engineers. They were that prominent in these military establishments, and that's how it's going to remain for pretty much for the rest of antiquity. Okay, so let's get to the point then. Can we demonstrate any of this outside of Greece is the main thing I'm thinking about. And we're going to look at three test cases, case studies. Patara, you can see Patara, the location. This is on the southwest corner of Lycia. We go up to the left, and that peninsula right below the text there is the Dacia Peninsula leading out to ancient Knidos, and above that the line of land there goes to Halikarnassus itself. And what we know is that the Mausolus became a very powerful satrap of the Persians. He was encouraged to help put down rebellions such as the rebellion of Evagrius in Cyprus and the rebellion of the Lycians. And so he installed bastions. He became the king of Lycia as well and installed bastions. And the dating of this bastion in the harbor, it's called the Tepigic Mountain. You can see the harbor of Patara and the inset to the left. And on the right-hand side of that little inlet harbor, you have the Tepigic Bastion, which controlled the main road to the city as well. This has been excavated by my good friend Erkan Dündar, who's now at the university, Akdeniz University in Antalya, and he found remarkable finds at this site. So here is the remains of the bastion, and I want to call your attention to the very narrow gate right there going between these two structures. Okay, so the main bastion is in the background, but it's part of it is right here, and that's the part that concerns us, because out in front, and the gate to the left is the outside. You're coming into the city. It's a very narrow gate. It can't even be more than a meter wide. It really wasn't meant to walk into the city. It was meant to gain access to this heavily fortified position, probably manned by Hecatomnian mercenaries. And here is the face of the structure that we were looking at, and the gate is over to the left, as you can see. And there is this slit in the wall. There is this embrasure, presumably for the installation of a ballista. It's near the gate, doesn't have that great a range, but it is facing the road. And so to get to that gate, you're going to have to get by the fire of this machine. And it's built into the fortification system at the time that it was destroyed. A lot of evidence that the place was fire damaged, and we got slingshot right there. They found several projectile heads of projectiles that were fired at the time. It was fire damaged. The artifacts were recovered by Professor Dündar, and the most significant one is this lead sling bullet inscribed Alexander, son of Philip. It's in the genitive, so this is the sling bullet of Alexander, son of Philip, is our assumption, as well as a Macedonian bugle, and that's one of the things they used to sound the attack and retreat and things like that. Bugles were actually fairly common at this point in military establishments. And so, first of all, the embrasure demonstrates the existence of an installation there for a ballista. It's a weird space behind it too, but it was remodeled heavily afterwards, rebuilt. But still, it's kind of a narrow triangular space. You can just kind of fit in it with the arm of the thing going backward. And then secondly, we know from Arrian that Alexander took Patara in 334 BC. It didn't really say that they put up a fight. It says it was kind of taken from within. It's not really clear. Maybe the city rebelled, but the fact is, Arrian says 334 BC, and we got a sling bullet of Alexander himself. So we can assume that the defenders, the Hecatomnid defenders of Patara at the time of Alexander's conquest, had a ballista in this bastion. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, the next one is Projectile, and you can look at my other video to get a sense of this. At this time, it was a Persian garrison. We're not really sure whether there was a satrap up there. It seems to have been a very important position because of the magnificent design of the palace that's in this fortress. But the fortress is what concerns us today. It's further east. It's on the south coast of what we call ancient rough Cilicia. And it's up on a promontory, very inaccessible, but it probably guarded some major road down from the Anatolian plateau. And so here's a reconstruction of the fortress itself. So it's a long promontory, and there's, at the beginning of it, it's all cliffs. It just juts out into the space, air. But there is access through a kind of a saddle, and they built the citadel right there. And the thing that's interesting here is that once again, there's an access way. You can see the ramp going up, and you can see the gate. The ramp goes up, and then you have to turn right to go in through the gate. So, and then facing the ramp, there is an embrasure in the wall. So we see entrance ramp, gate, and embrasure. And not only at this citadel, but at the far end, there's another path up to the promontory, to the garrison system. And it has the exact same system there. So here is a view of the embrasure. Again, I'm standing on the ramp looking up, and then to the right behind me, is the gate itself. So the embrasure is pointing right down at anybody coming up the ramp. And here it is from behind. Now this citadel was heavily remodeled, completely remodeled in the Ptolemaic period. And so we have to allow for the possibility that this actually dates to the Ptolemaic garrison there in the early 3rd century, I think from about 270 down to 230 BC, right in there, the upper half of the 3rd century BC. It could be theirs, in other words. We have to allow for that possibility. Here's the map showing the far end of the site and the gate leading up from below. Again, this is kind of a cliff face, but there was a way up with switchbacks. And looking up on the hill there in the upper left, you can see the embrasure, the pathway, the ramp is kind of ruined. But just to the left of that embrasure is the gate in from this side of the site. And there's a view of the gate, there's the embrasure. It's kind of damaged, but the interior shows this same kind of triangular space for the arm of the machine. It's very narrow, almost like a cockpit. Very similar to the one at Patara. Okay, so what am I getting at here? This has got nothing to do with Hecatomnids. It could be Ptolemaic, but it's just as easily safe to assume that this is a Persian installation, and that this technology, these ballistas, were being used by Persian defenses throughout the Persian Empire. I happen to have two sites here where we can narrow the date significantly and get it right there to the period there, before Alexander the Great, when everything changes dramatically. Let's think of it that way. That's the point I'm trying to make. We're looking at the incipient evidence for the introduction to these weapons. And what we're seeing is that it's not just in Greece. It was in Sicily. He's fighting the Carthaginians. They had machines. The Carthaginians and the Phoenicians had a very extensive relationship, and we know that they traded and they sent embassies back and forth. They conducted their sacrifices at Tyre. It was a constant, fluid relationship between these two empires, and so we shouldn't be surprised that technology, maybe from Phoenicia, was adapted by the Carthaginians then readapted in Sicily, then adapted in Greece. Again, what we can't date is the circular pattern to that. What we can date is the advent of when did it come online in Greece. That's what we're seeing. But the reason I'm going to these sites is to point out that that doesn't mean it was the earliest necessarily. The last one's more complicated. That's why I saved it to the end. This is the defenses of the ancient city of Halikarnassos. Alexander will besiege the city. The siege will go on for a year. This was an impregnable place for some reason. It was built, it was taken over and built up as a capital by Mausolus the Hecatomnids. And he lived from 377 to 353. So in his reign, probably early on, he took over Halikarnassus. He moved his capital from north in Milas-Sarankaria and fortified this city. He's got a beautiful harbor. He built his fortified castle in the harbor with a big boat harbor for warships. And then he extended these walls up into the countryside. One of the earliest confirmed Galanmauer systems in the Greek world. We're looking at the great Mindos Gate, the best preserved portion of the defenses right here. This is on the western end of town. It faces the city of Mindos, the road to Mindos. And here is the outline. You got the central harbor, you've got the castle to the lower right of that round interior harbor. And then you've got this defensive system, this system of walls and towers that goes up the hillside and then kind of along the plain above the city and then up to another sort of promontory where we have a bastion up there and then back to the shore, completely enclosing, again, the built environment of the city. Preventing the possibility of adversaries firing down on the city from those heights. So that's in principle. There are some interesting, tricky things to this, though. Okay, so what else do we know? We can see right here the quarry cut. Notice how it kind of takes an angle right there where the gate is. There was a quarry cut moat or trench out in front of the parapets, so that making it even more difficult for you to assault the parapets in this way. Again, we're looking at the Mindos Gate. And it's interesting, as you get higher up in the hillside, you can still see the walls are pretty much gone. Here's a stretch of it right there. But you can see the consistency of the trench. And these experts who have researched this, Danish scholars such as Mr. and Professor Peterson, have argued that, okay, so no matter what kind of architecture, they're following the line of the original walls here. The interesting thing is, when you get away from the Mindos Gate, the mode of construction varies enormously. And you get these long stretches like this, where we can see kind of the same large polygonal kind of blocks, irregularly cut blocks on the faces. And notice the big blocks they even use as the fill here. But this is not the very, very fine dressed masonry that we see in the Mindos Gate. And this is the circuit wall heading from the Mindos Gate down to the shore. So it's possibly one of the earliest components to the walls. Again, if we look at the Mindos Gate again, one of the things we can say is notice the evenness of the courses of blocks. So they have figured out how to dress these blocks into almost perfect rectangles. They leave the surfaces bossed. We think maybe that helped withstand the impact of firing machines. But it's all very well aligned. And then on the corner of the tower itself, you can see how they've drafted the corners of those blocks to form kind of a line right there. What am I getting at? It looks to me like this may have been a later addition to the fortifications, and we don't know what the early towers necessarily looked like. But I haven't studied the whole thing, so I'm going to hold it in abeyance. What we know is that this place could not be taken by Alexander. He had to move on, and eventually it kind of capitulated after the siege went on for a year. But it wasn't really stormed necessarily. From the Mindos Gate, you can almost see it to the kind of to the left. You can see the line of the walls going up this mountain. And then up there, it takes a very strange turn, right-angled turn, eastward, and cuts across this kind of highland plain behind the city. Again, you can see the moat in the upper picture, and you can see the rough blocks. Again, but this is so ruined, I don't want to say anything about the fortifications here. I was able to get over to the eastern side. I didn't get to the bastion that's out there at the top of that hill, but I did get some views of things. And for example, here's a tower on the above me, where you can see the drafted corner, very fine drafted corners, making those courses nice and even. But a stretch of the wall that was kind of back toward the city, not too far from that, you can see very irregular blocks, especially at the base of this thing. So what am I getting at? I think there are very clearly multiple phases of construction in this fortification system. And apart from the line of the walls and the trench, I don't know how much we can really date as being certainly in existence at the time of Alexander's siege. Like the corners with the drafted edges there, I'm inclined to think that that might be a technique employed by the engineers of Demetrius, the city besieger, but that's nothing I can prove. I'm just throwing it out there. Okay, but just kind of keep that in mind. Here we are up on the heights, looking back at the medieval castle, which is now the museum, the Belgium Museum, where they store all the amphores and shipwrecks that were found by the Institute of Nautical Archaeology's researchers. And we're looking at the harbor from this vantage point. The interesting thing is that, like I said, let's go to the next slide. We're at that corner on the left, and then it goes straight across what is kind of a low flat part, and then it goes up to a promenade. Here's the weird thing. When I went looking for this, I went way up the mountain, behind the walls, above the walls out there to the top of the picture, looking for the remains of the walls, and I had to come back down to find this turn in the wall, and it goes right through a developed area of neighborhood, so very hard to locate it today. But the interesting thing is that it seems like the heights above the walls, you could put your machines up there and fire down on the walls. Now there may be some sort of a gully or ravine there just before the walls. What am I getting at? This is not your ideal perfect example of Gewandmauer fortifications that we could show you in so many city defenses in the post-Alexander the Great era, where people adapted this. It looks like an early version of it. It's an early version of it, and I think it has a kind of vulnerable length there. That long, straight area above the harbor seems incredibly vulnerable to assault. But what do I know? I mean, maybe there's something we don't understand in that regard. But again, can't really say with Halicarnassus. And so when you put that together with the example at Messini, well, maybe this weaponry and the technology was even further along at this point, the mid 4th century BC, than I'm trying to suggest. I think we're at the infancy of this, and we're watching how the adaptation of these weapons into the defensive systems is changing the nature of the construction of the walls themselves. But it's an imperfect picture. We're going to have to accept the fact that there's a lot of fumbling going on here, and a high likelihood of error in that regard as well. And we will leave it there, and then next part we will talk about Alexander's sieges and what we know about that as well. I would just leave you with one thing, is that military technology tends to spread very rapidly, and it seems to me, based on the siege at Halicarnassus and the siege at Tyre, that the Persians, we could say Phoenicians, the Hecatomnids, the Persians, had all the same weaponry that Alexander had. In fact, they may have had more of it. He seems to have had to recruit things. He's got his siege train, but they seem to have had as much, if not more. And it leads me to believe that when you get to the point where kind of out of the way places like Patara and Maidancikali, I mean, this is not Athens. It's not Halicarnassos. And even they've got embrasures for these weapons. Tells me that they are relatively commonplace in the Persian Empire at this time. And we'll leave it there.